Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Well, good morning, and there's good news today as we conclude our study of the book of Zephaniah. We've had 2 weeks of woe and misery and judgment and what was wrong about the place, and now we're going to have good news. So we can smile again,
we can.
Lee.
This is a happy story, and I think
happy ending.
It's a happy ending, and it kind of... It foreshadows to me the gospel, which is the good news. And the good news is going to be seen in our gospel good news as well. But we'll get to that later. And
we'll try to do a summarization of the whole book when we go a little farther.
Yeah, these weeks that we've spent in Zephaniah has really reminded me that Zephaniah is a very short but beautiful summary of the message that we get in some of the much longer prophetic books.
Yes.
But it's like a nice summary statement of it. It starts out with the fact that God's expectations for his covenant people have been severely disappointed.
Yes.
That the people have turned against God in two main ways. One, in terms of their religious life. They're worshiping other gods.
Yes.
They're worshiping idols. But then also in their moral and interpersonal lives, and
actually in their relationship with one another as fellow Israelites. There are wedges that have been driven between them by class, by function, and by heritage. And it's not like it was, at the beginning, where they were all interdependent and all more or less equal.
And to make matters worse, their leaders have been some of the worst offenders when it comes to immoral behavior in their interpersonal behavior, and they've taken advantage of their position of power and rank and have really severely oppressed some of their own Israelite people who lack that power and influence that they have.
That's always a terrible misfortune for a people to have. It's bad enough to have pressure from outside, but to have this kind of unhappiness and struggle and cheating one another within fellow citizens, among fellow citizens, it's a sad picture.
So first, Zephaniah, as the other prophets, established the sins of Israel.
Yes.
And then he establishes what God is going to do about those disappointed expectations, and that is bring some pretty literal punishment upon the people, military invasion and physical destruction of the land.
That's true. Now, the lesson is entitled, A Day of Joy for the Remnant. And we're going to have to talk about the remnant tradition in Israel. Zephaniah didn't invent this. He is using an idea that was well over 100 years old. And it becomes a very important part of the prophetic message and line of thought.
All the prophets, even the most dreary ones like Amos, hold out hope that there will come a time on the other side of judgment and destruction when at least some of God's people will be restored in their relationship to Him and restored to their homeland after a period of exile.
That's based on a view of God, that God is faithful no matter what. And this is the way in which that is worked out. Why don't I read what we have? We do have to clean up a few questions in the text, and then we can discuss this further.
Great.
So I get to read this time. And we're in Zephaniah, and we'll begin at verse 9, and our viewers will recall that we concluded last week's lesson with verse 8. So what we have this morning is a continuation of where we stopped last week in chapter 3. Then I will purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, my scattered people will bring me offerings. On that day, you, Jerusalem, will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me, because I will remove from you your arrogant boasters. Never again will you be haughty on my holy hill, but I will leave within you the meek and humble. The remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord. They will do no wrong, they will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. Sing, daughter Zion. Shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. Now moving down to the very last verse in the book. This is how it ends. Verse 20, at that time I will gather you. At that time I will bring you home. I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord. End of book.
And a very hopeful ending it is, too.
Now let's go back through the text and just make a few things clear that may not be totally clear here.
Now when I read, I will purify the lips of the peoples, I get a kind of a literal, physical picture here, kind of like in Isaiah's call to be a prophet, where a burning coal was placed on his lips. But,
yes.
But there's a more general message here, I think.
Well, let me read the Revised Standard Version on that, because I think it's better, and it will serve our purposes better. Yea, at that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that they may call on the name of the Lord. And the word peoples here could be referring to Israelites, to people from the northern tribe that have been scattered, and also to non-Israelite people. It's a more general term than nations. Now, nations appeared earlier in this book, and sometimes that's translated Gentiles. It's usually referring to outsiders. The word peoples can refer to insiders as well as and also outsiders.
Now, this idea of pure speech, it doesn't have to do with talking properly.
Oh, well, I've always said at this point, when this prophecy is fulfilled, everybody will speak Hebrew.
Oh, okay. Well, I had
That's the pure speech.
I had a student ask me once if that meant they wouldn't be cussing anymore if they had pure speech. But what this has to do, in fact, this verse explains what it means by changing their speech to a pure speech, when it goes on to say, all of them will call on the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord.
Yeah, now what this is call on the name of the Lord is terminology that goes way back to Genesis and all the way through the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. It's a generalized term, could be worship Yahweh exclusively, right. I think may be the implication here.
I think it is. An acknowledgement of Yahweh as God, and then worship of Yahweh. And many of the prophets looked forward to such a time when all peoples would come. I mean, there's that beautiful passage in Isaiah and Micah, almost word for word the same, where all the peoples will flow like rivers to Mount Zion, to Jerusalem, and will gather at the temple and bring unified praise to God.
Right, and call upon the name of the Lord also in places where it occurs, seems to refer to praying to God,
Okay.
or to worshiping, offering worship that God approves of toward God in the form of sacrifice and so forth.
It's paired with the verb serve here in verse 9.
And serve has this double entendre as well. It means to work for, and we get the word slave from the same verbal root, but it also is used for worship.
Right.
Avodah is another form of the same word, meaning the service that we conduct in worshiping God.
Yeah.
So he works for both.
I don't hear the phrase much anymore, but I grew up talking about when Christians gather together, calling that a worship service, or a service of worship. You know?
Yeah.
And
service is the verb that's used here.
Yes. And I never thought about that much until I got older, but that's a beautiful combination of two concepts that overlap and yet are slightly different as well. What we do is worship God, and that worship is an act of service.
Right.
At the same time.
Yes.
But then there's also a broader expression of Christian service fueled by our praise of God and initiated by it. So,
yes, that's a development.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the mind of the Old Testament, it's everything connected with the temple, the priesthood, the ritual, the offerings, and that's what's meant by service. Mm-hmm. We mean something different.
Broader, much broader.
Yes.
But we get those two verbs right there, calling on the name of the Lord and serving Him. By the way, the phrase shoulder to shoulder.
Now, we need to say something about that.
Yeah, well,
literally, it means one shoulder. Uh-huh. And I think it's an idiom for together in harmony.
Yes. I said a minute ago of one accord or in unity.
The word one is the prominent word here.
In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the phrase is translated under one yoke. So they're picturing animals who have been yoked together, pulling in unity to one goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, we have a problem in verse 10, beyond the rivers of Cush. Where in the world is Cush? Somewhere in the world, but you can't be sure exactly where.
Well, the word Cush is most commonly identified with either Ethiopia or a neighboring nation, the Sudan. And in fact, the Greek translation of the Old Testament does use the word Ethiopia here. So they thought it was referring to Ethiopia.
But really, that's a very long way away. That's much further away than Egypt.
Yes, much further than Egypt.
Whether there was contact between Ethiopia and Palestine in the 600s, is a question that we could argue about and discuss and research. But I have a feeling that the word Cush is one of those words that may apply to several locales.
It could well be. I think the point is just imagine the most faraway place to which Israelite people could have migrated or been exiled. Mm-hmm. Just imagine someplace way down in Africa or way over, east of Mesopotamia. God will bring
wherever,
scattered
whatever
people,
these rivers are,
wherever Cush is, wherever the rivers are, because that's the real point of verse 10.
Now, you pointed out before we turned the cameras on very correctly that the word Cush appears in terms of his genealogy, that is the genealogy of Zephaniah.
Yeah, Cush is mentioned surprisingly often in this little book. It's mentioned here. It's mentioned back in chapter 2, where he's talking about God's judgment on other nations.
Yes.
He mentions Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Assyria, and he mentions Cush. And then, of course,
that would lead one to think that perhaps Cush is in the direction of Assyria.
Yeah, it could be.
And there's some thought. But also, wasn't Moses' wife considered
Zipporah
to be a Cushite?
Yeah, Zipporah, Moses' wife, was called a Cushite. And Otherwise, her family seems to have come from Midian, which is down there in the Sinai Peninsula. In the Sinai Peninsula. So,
but there aren't very many rivers in Sinai.
No, there aren't, and we don't know. Had an African family from Ethiopia or Sudan migrated up there? It's really hard to know. But I think the point is that God is now ready to call back a remnant of His people from the ends of the earth, wherever they have gone.
Yes.
And when those worshipers, when those people come back, those scattered people, verse 10 now.
And they will bring offerings.
Yes.
Now, bringing offerings refers to an act of common worship together in the courts of the temple.
Yeah.
So
there's that worshiping idea again.
Now, and again, on that day, in verse 11, this is language of the day of the Lord.
Okay, we've seen that theme all the way through Zephaniah.
Exactly.
Now, when we were talking about the day of the Lord the last 2 weeks, we talked about it as a time of destruction, military invasion, literal destruction of cities and the temple.
But it doesn't have to refer to destruction of the Israelites. In fact, the Israelites, when they used the term in common speech, they were talking about God's destruction of other people.
Okay. Well, now we've
the
learned.
Prophets had to come along and say, well, now look, the day of the Lord can mean your suffering as well as anybody else's. And then that's the way Zephaniah uses the term for sure.
But in this passage, we see that the day of the Lord will end, that day, that period of history will end.
It's going to be a change, a reversal for Israel.
There'll be a time of restoration.
This time, on that day, is a good thing for Israel.
So the day of the Lord, the meaning shifts a little bit, and here in verse 11, we see that shift where the people of God will not be put to shame. All the wrongs you have done to me.
Jerusalem will not be put to shame.
Yeah.
And instead of, Jerusalem is going to be brought down.
Right.
But now restored.
Yeah. And many of the people who arrogantly worshiped other gods or claimed property from other people, this is a kind of arrogance that doesn't respect God or God's people.
Well, in Jeremiah, we see arrogance in a different way. He challenges them on it, and that is the arrogance of people who know that they are God's people. This is God's city, Jerusalem, and this is God's temple, the only place where God is to be found on earth, and hence there is this haughtiness. Nobody can defeat us. Because we have God here in this building with its courts.
And I think that may well be what's in Zephaniah's mind, because at the end of verse 11, never again will you be haughty on my holy hill.
Yes.
And the holy hill is a reference to Zion,
where
the place where the temple stood.
Exactly.
And it was the priests themselves who were saying, oh, God will never allow us to be destroyed because we have the temple. So the
temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, as Jeremiah mocked them.
Right. So that those haughty priests, perhaps, will be removed from the holy hill.
Now, in verse 12, we got to talk about the remnant of Israel. It's part of the title of the lesson, and we have to go back to earlier prophets where the whole doctrine of the remnant emerged, especially in Isaiah, very prominent in Isaiah, and all the prophets that followed Isaiah. And when God brought His judgment on the northern kingdom, there wasn't anything left of the northern kingdom. But now, the remnant is going to be a different answer to what follows the punishment. And it's Isaiah that best spells this out way back in the 700s. And what he says is, in God's name, of course, is that yes, we're going to suffer. He named one of his kids Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. The destruction is coming, and it's coming rapidly. But he named another kid, Shar Yashuv, a remnant will return. Mm-hmm. And the third kid was named Emmanuel.
God with us.
God is with us. Mm-hmm. And God is going to stay with us so that we're going to suffer, but there will be the remnant of the meek, the humble, and God will then bring them back and rebuild. And out of that comes the idea of a son of David. Mm-hmm. A boy will come as the leader of the people and lead them into an era of utopian peace and tranquility. So there you have the remnant wrapped up, as Isaiah tells it. And it appears everywhere else in the following prophets. And so here it is in Zephaniah. That's the hope. Mm-hmm. There's the good news.
Yeah. The early part of verse 12 includes two words that reappear in the teachings of Jesus very prominently and in Christian language. The word, it's translated here, meek and humble. And Jesus incorporated that first word in the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek. And it's a word that frequently gets translated gentle. And gentleness has to do with not just weakness. So meekness is not weakness, but it's strength.
That's a good statement. Meek is not weak.
Meek is not weak, no. Gentleness is strength under control. So to be gentle, in other words, you would never see a horse lying in a field sick and say, oh my, what a gentle horse that is. That's a sick horse. But if you saw one of those thoroughbreds up in Kentucky or standing there and its muscles rippling and everything, but it came over and let you pat its flanks there, you'd say, whoa, what a gentle horse. So that's strength under control. Yeah. Right. And then humbleness is the term that Paul uses so beautifully in Philippians chapter 2, where he talks about the self-humbling of Jesus.
Now, humbling has appeared in this book already.
Yes, it has to do with lowliness.
Yes, and that's a good word, because the root seems to be exactly that, lowly. Exactly. The lowly ones.
Yeah. I like the latter part of verse 12 and on into 13, because it reverses some of the sins of the Jews that we saw earlier in Zephaniah. One of the charges against them was that they no longer put their trust in the Lord.
Exactly.
But the remnant will trust in the name of the Lord.
Right.
And earlier in the chapter, they were doing wrong. They were evildoers. Here, they will do no wrong.
It won't tell lies.
Won't tell lies.
And won't have a deceitful tongue.
You know, the latter part of verse 13 reminds me of the 23rd Psalm.
Exactly.
Doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
The image of sheep, perhaps, lying down and eating, and no one will make them afraid.
Right. Now, in verse 14, we have an outburst of rejoicing and singing and shouting, and we need to clarify, some may have a Bible that says, daughter of Zion, which would maybe suggest that Zion has a child. Zion, of course, is Jerusalem, and so there is some satellite city or something like that. But that's not what this language is.
It's calling Jerusalem the daughter of God.
Yes, God's daughter.
God's daughter, yeah.
And so it's daughter who is named Zion.
Yeah.
And Zion refers to the Temple Mount here.
Right. Let me quickly summarize a couple of the themes in the verses that are left out of our printed text.
Very good, because these verses are very important, but I guess they figured they couldn't get them in.
They just didn't have space.
Didn't have
Verse
space.
15 says, the Lord has taken away the judgments against you. We saw those judgments in the last lesson, but now in this time of restoration, that judgment is being taken away.
Yes.
And the Lord, the King of Israel, is in your midst. We see that. We saw that back in chapter 3, verse 5, where no matter what Israel does, no matter what Judah does, God's presence remains with them. You talked about the faithfulness of Yahweh.
Yes. Even when he has to threaten and cajole and even strike He is there, and He is never going to walk away.
Yeah. And so that idea of God being in their midst is reiterated several times in these verses. And then it says, God will renew you in His love. That's a beautiful statement of God's compassion and mercy for His people.
The main characteristic of God is love, even in the Old Testament.
Yeah, right. And then it says that this day will become not a day of mourning, not a day of fear, but a day of festival, which reminds us of some of the great celebratory gatherings.
Now, the word that's used there in the Hebrew text is the term that is used to summarize Passover, unleavened bread, weeks, and tabernacles. So those are the festivals.
Yeah, so we have the two themes there. The one is the gathering together of the scattered peoples, and the other is the worship of God, putting their focus on God.
Actually, the festival is a pilgrimage festival, and it involves going wherever you are to Jerusalem. So it's coming together and standing as one.
Which is the theme of this passage.
Exactly.
Let me mention one other thing in verse 19. I will save the lame and gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise.
Yes.
Here we see the great reversal. Whereas the weak and the lowly were the ones that had been oppressed by those wicked leaders, now God is raising them up.
Yes.
And that's another part of the gospel message, by the way, in the New Testament.
One other thing is God is a warrior. A warrior in verse 17. The Yahweh, your God, is in your midst, a warrior who gives victory. And then you have Him renewing you in love. In the same context.
So earlier in the book, the divine warrior, God, was the one who brought judgment and destruction.
That's the day of the Lord.
Right, and now we see the warrior is the one who gives them victory that they can share in.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's a big reversal going on here.
To summarize then the whole book of Zephaniah, what we have is judgment of God on Israel. Secondly, God's judgment on Israel's neighbors. Thirdly, God's judgment on Jerusalem. And then fourthly, we have God's salvation and reversal of their. And isn't that, after all, what lies behind the gospel message?
It is. It's the gospel message. It's the story of the prodigal son and the father welcoming the prodigal back home. It's the story of the good news of reconciliation that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 5. And the last verse of this book summarizes it so beautifully. I will gather you. There's the return. I will bring you home. Reconciliation. I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples. There's respect. And then I will restore their fortunes, your fortunes. There's the renewal.
Yes.
Restoration.
Well, and so this is getting us ready now to move into the New Testament and to see how this is going to be transformed into the message of Christ, the gospel message of Christ in Romans.
Very good.
We're glad you could be with us, and we do hope that you have been encouraged by the message of hope for the future, that God doesn't ever leave us, and no matter what we do or how bad we become. We'll come back and be in Romans next week, so we look forward to that, and we look forward to seeing you. God bless you this week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.